Well, welcome to Marketplace. We're glad that you guys are here. For those of you who are newer, because there's some new faces, Dave Cavan is the gentleman who started this Bible study about 5 years ago. Dave is almost always here, but texted me yesterday and said he was going to be in New York City this week. Yeah, exactly. And he's going to be there with a group called CEO Forum and then also doing business. So Lord willing, he'll be back with us next week and continuing on in our study. And so, I give a lot of thought over the summer when we take a break as to, exactly what we want to study at Marketplace, throughout the year. And as I was, thinking about it this past summer, I've been joking about this the last few weeks, I landed on the book of Esther. And it's because I've taught the book before, and out of the 16 or 17 books of the Bible that I have taught, if I was going to ever write a book on one of them, it would be Esther, only because I felt like the Lord really spoke to my heart and mind a few years back when I was studying this book. And the reason I laugh about it is because it's a book about a woman. And so I thought, how dare we as a men Bible study a book about a woman? But as we're seeing, and I hope you've seen this already, if not, you'll definitely see it more today, it is not a feminine book. It might be a book about a woman, but it's far from feminine. In fact, it's probably, maybe next to 1st and 2nd Kings, the most rough and tumble book in all of the Bible. I mean, filled with action and drama and, quite frankly, some very, very serious things. And so it's an amazing book, and I would argue especially for men. In fact, maybe if I ever write a book on it, I'll call it Esther for Men or something like that, and we'll just give a male approach to Esther. So we've looked at a couple of different subjects. We've set up the whole book a few weeks ago, and then we noticed the difference between pride and humility a couple of weeks ago, and then last week, I didn't plan it would be a two-parter, but we're in no hurry. We started taking a look at the theme that I've entitled The Price of Righteousness. The Price of Righteousness. Let me just give a very quick review of where we went last week, and then we're going to continue on this week. And I started off last week by basically throwing out before you guys that righteousness turns heads. That was my main point last week. Righteousness turns heads. In other words, when a lost world, and even a found world, I guess, when believers and unbelievers see an act of righteousness, sometimes a simple act, many times a profound act, they tend to take notice. They tend to go, wow, that's unusual in a fallen world in which we see a lot of unrighteousness, when we see a lot of crud, to see somebody do something that would be incredibly righteous. So I told you the story of my friend Tony, and how in my first church 20 years ago, Tony was a wealthier guy in the suburbs of Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and he gave an outrageous loan to a very, very needy family. And then it didn't stop there. As he gave this loan to them, just about a month later, he felt like it would be bad for them to pay off this loan, so he forgave the loan and forgave the debt. And I went into much more detail last week with the story, but just suffice it to say that the few of us that saw that back then, mainly the people in his small group, were just blown away at that kind of generosity, at that kind of care. You just don't see that very often. And the reason I tell you all that is because that's what the end of chapter 2 and all of chapter 3 is about with Esther. It's about this theme of righteousness and what happens when you and I decide to be righteous in our lives. So real quick background to Esther. As you guys remember, there's 3 main players in the book of Esther. There's Esther, who is the queen. She used to be a humble Jewish gal, and the Jews are now in slavery, essentially, in exile in Persia, and so they're in a foreign nation, but through a strange turn of events, Esther becomes the queen of this nation, but she's married to a guy named Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus, you might remember, is a guy who is kind of addicted to pleasure and angry at the same time. So he's a megalomaniac of first-rate order, and so he's your typical tyrant and king back then. And then Esther's cousin is a guy by the name of Mordecai. He's a third player in this story. And Mordecai is kind of looking out for Esther and making sure that she's okay as she's gone from these very humble roots to now being the queen of all of Persia. And so what happens at the end of chapter 2 and early chapter 3 is that Mordecai, you might remember, and this is really important, commits 2 acts of righteousness. He does 2 things that will go down in the whole history of the book of Esther as kind of the turning point for righteousness. The first thing he does is he finds out about this plot against the king to assassinate the king, which wouldn't surprise anybody because he wasn't a nice king. And he uncovers the plot. And he lets Esther know, and Esther lets the king know, and before you know it, the plot is foiled, and it was a righteous thing to do. And I pointed out to you last week that the reason we know it was righteous, why? Is because the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder. So even though God and the law and other things aren't mentioned in the book of Esther, we see it in play as Mordecai did something very righteous based upon the 10 Commandments, and that is that he revealed a plot for murder. That's the first act of righteousness. And then the second act was even more risky, more gutsy, and this was when Haman, one of the officers in the Persian army, wants everybody to bow to the king and kind of worship the king. That's what they did back in monarchies back then. And everybody bows but Mordecai. So he refuses to bow. And again, I pointed out last week, why is that an act of righteousness? Again, go back to the 10 Commandments, which every Jew knew back then. The very first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not worship them. You shall not bow before them. And Mordecai knew that. So his second act of righteousness was to not bow while everybody else was bowing. So I ended last week with this, and this is what I wanted you to think of, and that is that Mordecai did what was right regardless of the potential cost. He revealed a plot that he could have been seen as mixed up in it and gotten in trouble with it. And then he also didn't bow no matter what the cost. So he did what was right regardless of the cost. And you needed to recognize that he did what was right based upon the Bible, based upon God's revelation to him. And that's really important because you and I today live in a world and even a Christian subculture that tends to do what is right when it's convenient for us, and we do what is right in our own eyes. And so that's what we fleshed out last week and talked about how you and I can be more righteous based upon God's word no matter what the cost was. And that's where we ended last week. Now, what I want to do today is continue on in our study here and notice 2 more points that are on your outline there and continue to flesh out this theme of righteousness because the action heats up at this point in the story of Esther. And so here's the next point, and that is that many times in a fallen world, righteousness is going to be met with injustice and even persecution. And so follow along what happens next with Mordecai and his right choices. And again, I'm just going to give you kind of a lay of the land for chapter 3, and then I'll show you a couple of verses so that you can see this in the text. Some of the officials obviously have noticed that Mordecai is not bowing down. It would be obvious because everybody was bowing and Mordecai would be standing up. And so they rat him out to Haman, again, who was one of the generals in the army. And Haman, who tends to be as angry as the king, Ahasuerus, the text says, becomes enraged, like really mad. And instead of just taking out his anger on Mordecai, like Ahasuerus did with his previous wife, he remembers that historical feud that the Agagites and the Israelites have had going back centuries. And so he comes up with a plan that basically says, and talk about overkill, no pun intended, that I'm not going to just get back at Mordecai. I think we should exterminate the entire Jewish population in Persia. And you need to remember, almost all the Jews at that time had been exiled. This is about 400 BC, had been 450 maybe BC, had been exiled from the land of Israel into Persia. So historians estimate that there were between 1 and 3 million Jews living in Persia at that time. So when Haman says that he wants to exterminate all of the Jews, this is huge. I mean, it's a plot like never before seen at that time in the history of the world. And so look at what happens next in chapter 7. As they try to pick a date for when this proposed extermination would happen. Look up here on the screen. It says in the first month, which is the month, I always want to say Nisan, but it's Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, per that is Lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Now, pause there. This is like one of those passages, if you were reading Esther for the very, very first time, you'd be like, big whip. They cast Pur. And so, and they were, you might not even know what that's about, but you wouldn't care what it's about because you don't think it's important. This is actually the hinge verse for the entire book of Esther, and this would actually become the verse that will make Esther the important book that it is, and this will become the verse that will define an entire Jewish celebration now, 2,500 years later, known as Purim. So let me explain what's going on here. I want you to think about it. In cultures that don't have the Bible, and yet cultures that still believe in some sort of divine influence, they need to have some way to hear from God, right? I mean, everybody wants to hear from God. You and I as Christians, when we want to hear from God, go to his book, the Bible, and that's how we have intelligent knowledge about God. But in cultures that don't have the Bible or don't fall under the authority of the Bible, they have to have some way to believe in God or to hear from God. And so 2,500 years ago, when you had the Assyrians and then the Babylonians and then the Persians, the three nations that exiled Israel, being the kind of culture that did believe in spiritual things but didn't fall under God's word, they developed all kinds of superstitious methodologies to hear from God, kind of like we do today. You know people that look at horoscopes? Do you know people that read tarot cards, things like that? It would be exactly the same thing. We have people today that don't fall under the authority of the Bible. They want to hear in the spiritual realm, so they go to mediums and astrologers and they read the horoscope and things like that. Well, back then, what they would do is they developed a method using various spiritual dice that were called Pur, P-U-R, and these were made up of small fragments of stone and pottery with writing on them, kind of like dice. And what they would do when they were trying to get an answer to a question like, what date should we exterminate the Jews, is that they would roll the dice. They would take these Pur and they would roll them, and it would come up, and no one knows all the details of this, but it would come up in a certain way, and when the dice came up, they would have their answer. And so Haman basically rolls the dice here. He rolls the Pur, and it falls on the 13th day of the month of Adar, which is a winter month in the Jewish calendar that usually corresponds to March in our calendar. And Haman chooses a date that from that time is about 10 to 11 months away to annihilate 1 to 3 million Jews. And that's really what the whole book of Esther is about, is the fact that this plot to exterminate the Jews happens. They throw the Pur, and it's now 10 to 11 months away that they are declaring the extermination of all the Jews. Now, here's what I want you to see. All because of one man's act of righteousness. All because Mordecai would not bow, one guy, they decided to exterminate all the Jews. Now, knowing that he couldn't just go ahead and kill 1 to 3 million Jews without Ahasuerus' permission, Haman basically spends the rest of chapter 3 convincing Ahasuerus that he should allow them to exterminate all the Jews. And the way he does it is time-tested, and it's gone on for thousands of years, and it goes on today. He basically categorized them as an evil people. The text literally says that Haman went to Ahasuerus and said, you know, those people over there, those people that are mooching off us, those people who are not really Persian, those people who really aren't like us. If you ever hear other people refer to other people as those people, warning flags ought to be going off in your mind, because that's the way people have been thinking for years, and that's exactly how he convinced Ahasuerus to do this. And so for whatever reason, Ahasuerus agrees with Haman, and what the king does next seals the deal. Look at verses 10 through 11. It says, then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please. Now, again, I'm giving you a lot of history today, but we're going to put all this together in a minute for something very practical. But that signet ring thing is very important here. Because some of you would say, well, sure, the king told Haman he could do what he could do, but when he would find out that these are the Jews and that Esther, his wife, is Jewish, and she's going to plead with him not to allow the Jews to be exterminated, he can just go back on what he said he would do, right? No. Not when you use the signet ring. You see, back then, the king had a special ring with a special stamp on its face that he would use to seal official documents. And whenever the seal was used, it gave that document or that person full and unhindered authority to do what it said he could do because it was from the king. It was his signature, if you will. And so when it says that Ahasuerus gave Haman the signet ring, basically this gives Haman free rein to do what he said he was going to do. And even the king in that culture, in the Persian culture, could not go back on the decision that the king had already made by giving that signet ring. So that's very important. And so it's here, as chapter 3 draws to a close, that Haman draws up the official edicts. He sends them throughout all of Persia, letting them know that in a few months there's going to be a free-for-all against all of the Jews to utterly destroy them and remove them from the face of the earth. And as I pointed out earlier, this is what you need to see, men. Complete and projected annihilation of an entire population of people because of one act of human righteousness. And though Bible experts might differ on what the heck is the practical point out of this one, I can remember reading Esther years ago, and the thought that came to me, and I think this is from the Spirit, is that many times in a fallen world, our righteousness is going to be met with injustice and even persecution. And it's not fair, and it's not good, and it's certainly not right or in any way justifiable. It's just that it's true. That when you're dealing with a world and even a culture that's in rebellion to God, a world that the Bible says over and over again is not our home and not our ultimate destination, a world that many times not only unappreciates but feels threatened by the presence of God's righteousness, there are going to be times, and in some cultures, even many times, when people are going to react to righteousness. Now, isn't this mind-blowing? With the exact opposite reaction than we think they should. I mean, one of the things that blows me away about chapters 2 and 3 here is that, Haman does one act of righteousness that everybody applauds, right? And that was revealing the plot. So he reveals the plot against the king, and the king is like, oh, thank you, I was going to get killed, and it's wonderful that you revealed that to me. And then he does another act of righteousness, equal in God's sight, and that's not bow before a human being and worship him. And this one results in the plot to annihilate all of the Jews. And I just sit there and go figure. I mean, one day he's like Mother Teresa, the next day he's like Hitler in people's eyes. I mean, it just blows my mind. And so the point is that righteousness, many times in a fallen world, is going to be met with injustice and even persecution. And what I think we need to see today, before we start to apply this even to our lives, or as we apply it to our lives, I guess, is that this doesn't mean that we should ever stop doing what is right. I mean, some Christians would say, well, gosh, if he had just bowed, it might have saved all the Jews. But what would God have thought about it if he had bowed? I mean, think about it. It's happened a lot in the 2nd and 3rd century. When the Christians were being persecuted, a lot of people said, well, golly, I mean, if I just bow to the king and worship him, I mean, God understands, and God must have grace and all of this. And so a lot of people bowed, and then when the persecution stopped, the Christian church didn't know what to do with all these people who had bowed. And it was kind of a scandal. It was kind of a big deal, because though our world doesn't think it's a big deal to not bow, God does. God thinks it's a huge thing, because it's righteousness, again, as we notice, based on his word, doing what is right. And so I don't think this means that we should ever stop doing what is right. What it means, and I guess this is this point I want to bring home to us this morning, to you and I, what it does mean is that you and I should not be surprised when a fallen world does not stand up and applaud our righteousness. I think that's the application to you and I today. I think we live in such in a sense, a Christian nation, historically a moral nation, that when we do right things and do what we know is right, we get kind of shocked. and disappointed, that other Americans don't applaud that, or they even get down on us for that. And I just sit there and say to myself as a pastor, well, what made you think that a fallen world that's in rebellion to God is going to fall down and call you blessed because you're following God? That they're just not going to do that. Peter, I think, nailed it. I don't know if I have this scripture up here or not. Let me see. Yeah, look at what Peter said to his audience. Again, about 500 years after this Esther event, about 2,000 years ago now, in New Testament times, Peter says, dear friends, do not be surprised at the painful trial you are suffering as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice that you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. See, I just think we need to have more of this mindset, especially as men living in America, that as you and I get more and more and more godly, and I don't mean more holier than thou, that's a prideful attitude. I'm just talking about at our core being, just doing what is right as we follow God. I think we need to do it for God. And I think we need to do it because it's right. And we need to accept the consequences as they are and stop getting all upset and disheveled when a fallen world doesn't applaud our righteousness. Because I think, especially in America, those days are just about over. There is an interesting story that came out a little while back. Some of you might have heard this story before, but it made the newspapers a few years back. It was about two teenagers who one night decided, instead of going to the school dance, they decided to bake cookies and deliver them to their neighbors. It was kind of a nice thing to do. You can see the girls, their names are Taylor and Lindsay. And so at about 10:30 at night, after baking cookies all day, they knocked on the door of their neighbors, and they would just leave the cookies there, and as kind of a surprise to say, we love you. And they went to one particular neighbor, 49-year-old Juanita Young, and when she yelled, who's there, when they knocked on the door, they didn't answer her right away because they wanted it to be a surprise. They wanted just to leave the cookies with a note that says, have a good night, love, T&L, Taylor and Lindsay. So she said, who's there? They didn't answer. They left the cookies and they walked away. And Juanita became so frightened when the door knocked and nobody answered, and she saw two shadows on her porch. She had an anxiety attack, went out the back door, spent the night at her sister's house, woke up the next day still shaking with an upset stomach, went to the hospital where they treated her for anxiety and released her a few hours later. When she finally got home, it was all revealed that the girls were the ones who did this. The two girls' families apologized, and they offered to pay for her medical bills, but she refused, and she sued them in civil court, citing that she wanted to teach them a lesson. This is a true story. Judge Doug Walker, who heard the case, sided with Juanita. Judge awarded her $900 fine from the girls. And as one of the girls wept after the court hearing, Juanita Young had this to say about it all. She said, these two girls used very poor judgment. I'm not gloating about it. The victory wasn't sweet. And then she said, I just hope the girls learned a lesson. Wow. Now, man, I got to ask you, and I remember reading this story a few years back, and my immediate thought was when I read this, I wonder what lesson the girls learned. Don't you? Yeah. I mean, if these were your daughters, and that woman said that to your daughters, what lesson do you think they learned? Do you think they learned that they shouldn't bake cookies and give them to neighbors at 10:30 at night? I hope that's not the lesson they learned. Do you think they learned that they shouldn't do thoughtful acts of kindness? I hope that's not the lesson that they learned. See, here's the lesson I would have taught my daughters if this happened to them, and I have two daughters, a little bit older than that now, and that is that I would have taught them that in a fallen world, there are times when you can do something so right and so good that it just might be met with injustice. That's what I would have taught my daughters. I would have said to them, what you did was right. What you did was well-motived, well-intentioned, and even it was a wonderful, loving act to do in our community. But even when you do something that is right, as sad as it is, we live in a fallen world that's in enmity with God, and there are going to be times when you and I do the right thing, and it's going to be met with injustice. You know, as I was thinking about our time here this morning in this exact topic, I thought, isn't it ironic that we're studying this, that we're making this point, and that we're meeting at the Alliance Defending Freedom headquarters? Now, that's somewhat ironic, because I don't know if you guys know this, but ADF, where we're meeting right now, they are the largest organization, one of the few, that is out there defending the freedom and rights of religious people, and particularly Christians. And as you can imagine, trying to do that in today's political climate is really difficult. And between them and Focus on the Family and other organizations that are on the front lines here, they get so much persecution. They get so much met with injustice at the righteousness that they're trying to do, that if all the stories could be told, it would probably curl your hair. I mean, honestly, how many organizations do you go into in North Scottsdale which you have a security guard out front? You ever wondered that? My church doesn't have that. We have Maddie, but that's just on Sunday mornings. And we just don't, most places just don't have a lot of security guards. Sorry, Maddie, I outed you there, didn't I? You just don't have that many security guards, but they have to have them here. I was at Focus's headquarters a few years back, and they still have on the wall a bullet hole where a guy came in trying to gun down James Dobson. And you sit there and say to yourself, that's insane. I mean, these guys are doing righteous things. I mean, Dobson's out there trying to fight for the family. ADF is simply trying to say that maybe religious people ought to have freedom and rights to be religious. And yet, in that act of righteousness, they are met with a tremendous amount of persecution. And that's just on a corporate level. I mean, I just think this happens all the time to you and I on a personal level. I can remember years ago when I first got saved. I got saved in 1981, and as I've told you guys, I had a very radical conversion to Christ. I mean, I was like Paul on the road to Damascus. I was going one way one day, and just boom, blinding light, and my soul was saved, and I was on fire. And so for the first couple of years, I went through what C.S. Lewis would call my first fervor. And if you've ever met a Christian in the midst of his first fervor, they're kind of annoying, because all they do is talk to you about Jesus and the Bible, and I mean, they just, they are so heavily minded, they're no earthly good. Yeah, that was me for about 2 years. And actually, I wouldn't trade those days for anything, because I needed that. I had done so much sinning up to that point in my life that I needed to go to the opposite extreme in order to get my soul balanced. But I was pretty vocal about my faith, and I would say I probably wasn't the most tactful. I was the kind of guy that would walk into a room and say, I've told you guys before, but how many walls are in this room? And they'd say 4. That reminds me of 4 spiritual laws. And I'd be off to the races, sharing my faith. And I did that a lot. I was working in college as a stock boy at a local Ace Hardware store back in Chagrin Falls area. And my boss was Jewish, but he wasn't like Mordecai Jewish. He was like, absolutely liberal. I don't believe in God. I'm a cultural Jew. And he was a very, very decadent man, very decadent. And so, I found out about his life and his decadence, and I just started talking to him about Jesus. And the second he found out I was a Christian, for reasons to this day I would never know, he took an incredible disliking to me. I mean, an incredible disliking. And I could tell you story after story, the things that he did to me that summer, that I look back now, and I'm glad I was in the midst of my first fervor, because they were just mortifying. I'd be unloading a truck, and the truck drivers would give me a dumb stare. They'd be laughing at me and look at me, and I'd say to my boss, Neil, later, I'd say, what was that about? And he said, I just told the truck drivers you were gay. And I said, well, that's not true. And he said, yeah, but he goes, you ought to see the look on their face when I tell them that. He would go and dirty the bathrooms just so I'd have to clean them. I mean, he'd just dirty them and just do disgusting things in the bathroom. And then he'd get on the intercom in the hardware store, and he'd say, Gamey, he called me Gamey. He'd say, Gamey, the bathrooms are dirty. This is a true story. I was very naive as a freshman in college, and one day he sent me to the drugstore down the road, and he said, I need you to buy me 20 of these. And he'd written it down. And so I went down and I went to the pharmacist and I handed him the note, and he asked me to get him 20 prophylactics. Now, I didn't know what a prophylactic was. Maybe some of you men don't know what prophylactics are. So I handed it to the pharmacist and I said, I need 20 of these. And he said, son, do you know what these are? And I said, no. And he said, they're rubbers. And I turned about 18 shades of red and I walked out of the store. One day I was driving home with my pickup truck. I was in the next town over, and I was just getting into my pickup truck, and a guy came up to me. This is actually kind of funny, and he said, there's a sign on the back of your truck. I thought he was referring to my bumper sticker. I had a bumper sticker that back then that said, Christians' retirement benefits are out of this world. I thought that was kind of cute. And so I put that on the back of my truck. So I assumed he was referring to my bumper sticker. He said, there's a sign on the back of your truck. And I looked at him and I said, that's okay, I'm a Christian. That's what I said to him. I drove home, and when I got out, I was walking behind my truck, and I noticed that Neil had put a huge sign on the back of my truck that said fag as I was driving home all through my hometown. And I thought to myself later, I wonder what that guy thought of when I said I'm a Christian, and not to worry about the sign. But I mean, on and on and on it went. All I did was tell him about Jesus, and he persecuted me all summer long. I'm glad I was in the midst of my first fervor, because I didn't demand my rights be met. I didn't make an EEOC complaint. I just took it on the chin. I just said, you know what, Luke chapter 6, love your enemies. At the end of the summer, it was really kind of cute. All the cash register ladies who had been seeing all of this all summer, all the staff knew about it. All the cash register ladies at the end of the summer went in and bought me a plaque. And at the end of the summer, they presented this plaque to me, and the plaque simply just had 3 words on it. It said, love your enemies. And they had seen me love Neil all summer long. And every time he'd do something to me, I'd smile at him. And again, when you're in your first fervor, I wish more Christians would have a first fervor, because when you're in the midst of your first fervor, nothing gets to you. I mean, I really bemoan it now, because now I tend to demand my rights more and want justice more and all this. But back then, everything Neil would do, I'd just look at him and I'd say, dude, it's okay. Jesus forgives you. Hell is a long time to burn, but Jesus forgives you. You know. And I did. I talked to him about hell, and I talked to him about what hell is like. And so it was an amazing summer. My guess is there have been times in which you guys might have experienced some negative consequences to your righteousness. And I think one of the things that Esther teaches us is that we need not be shocked when, at the end of the day, we find that we're not going to be applauded for our righteousness. And there are times we're even going to take heat for it. And again, this is America. I think we all know we got it really easy here, right? I mean, if you were living in China right now, or if you were living in even some Western European countries like Finland or Sweden, where they're starting to really get down on Christians. I mean, just the basic things that you and I do that are righteous, like go to church and talk about the things that we talk about, are outlawed in some of the Far East countries. And they're even starting to get down on them in some of the Western European countries. But I think those days are going to be coming more and more to America. I really do. And I think as they do, you and I need to not shy away from righteousness, because righteousness turns heads. It's just that righteousness is going to have a price. Now, one last thought, and then we'll go into some discussion. And this is, again, a thought that's kind of hidden in the book of Esther, but I think it is there. And it's this thought, and that is that in the end, God always prevails, and his people will ultimately be vindicated. Amen. See, I really believe that. Now, I want to explain what I mean by this. Is you and I wrestle with being righteous and wrestle with the cost of righteousness, one of the things that we need to remember is that God is God, and he has promised that he will ultimately vindicate the righteous. And I think this is partly what Esther teaches us, that when you do right, when you follow God and what he has clearly outlined in his Bible, that there will be times that things go great, there will be times when things don't go great, but in the end, God is going to prevail. In other words, it goes back to the 2 overriding themes that I introduced to you in the very first part of this study, and those are the themes of fate versus providence. You see, the Persians back then, like many people today, believed in fate. And fate is that impersonal, nebulous, deterministic force that somehow guides and determines what happens to you. And it's really what irreligious people believe when they want to be spiritual, that they believe in fate. So you guys hear it all the time in your world. Lose your job, must be fate. Got a divorce, it's fate. Find another job, fate. Get married again, fate. Kids don't turn out well, fate. I mean, it's been around for thousands of years now. And in fact, I would argue that it's fate that's driving Haman and Ahasuerus in this story. It's what that those dice are all about. They're just trying to tap into fate. There's no personal God that they can know and love and follow and learn about and have a relationship with. It's all about fate. And yet providence is the biblical ethic or biblical idea of a God who is personal, always in control, purposeful, never surprised, and more than anything else, a God who is taking this world somewhere in his great and awesome plan that at the end of the day cannot and will not be thwarted. And when you read Esther closely, I think this is one of the main themes of Esther. This theme of providence is huge. That though everybody is trying to get in the way of the Jews, or trying to exterminate the Jews, or trying to get in the way of God's plan for the Jews, God's going to have nothing to do with that. God is going to work his purpose for the Jews no matter what, and he's going to protect his people. And it's because of this theology of providence, this biblical truth that God is always in control and that things happen for a personal divine purpose, that I think it changes everything when you and I are doing what is right. Because providence means, don't miss this, men, that every righteous deed you do, based upon the scriptures, and that's motivated out of love for God and others, matters. That God is taking this world somewhere, and that what you do in his name and according to his will matters. And I don't think it matters how big or small your act of righteousness is. He's going to use it to advance his kingdom. And the reason I'm so rock solid on that is because God has been doing this now for thousands of years through his people, through normal, everyday people. That when normal, everyday people do what is right, on little things, when it comes to maybe helping a little old lady across the street or holding the door open for somebody, or on the very big things, like big decisions you might make in your business that might be costly, but it's right. When Christians, when followers of God do that, God is in that, and he says he's going to use that. And I guess I need to be clear that when I say his people will be ultimately vindicated, I don't want you to be misled by what this means. It means that either this side of heaven or the next, vindication, this idea of reward and even self-satisfaction for what we have done, is going to happen. But for some people, it's not going to happen until the next side of heaven. That's worst case scenario. That we know when we do what is right, at the very least, God is going to vindicate us in the next life, in the next world, in eternity. But many times he does it even now. We're going to study this passage next month at our church, but Galatians 6:9 says this. It says, "And let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we shall reap if we do not grow weary." And that's a promise. But again, you read other scriptures, and it's pretty clear that the promise is that we will reap, maybe in this world, definitely in the next. And what you need to know is that there have been entire generations of Christians that didn't see vindication this side of heaven, but I think they might be arguably closer to the throne than us in the next one. Like, for instance, the entire African American communities back in the 17 and 1800s during slavery. One of my favorite books on my bookshelf is a book called Conversations with God, 200 years of African American prayers. And it's an anthology of many African-American written prayers. And you read these prayers written by our African-American brothers and sisters during the 17 and 1800s when they were in slavery, and they had so much faith, so much hope, so much thirst for ultimate vindication, but many of them died before they'd ever see that. Many of them died before Abraham Lincoln. But God was watching, and God knows, and I think heaven's going to reveal that ultimate vindication. The scriptures affirm that for our acts of righteousness. So why do I say this? You and I need to do what is right, that no matter what the cost it is. And if anything, we set our sights on heaven, saying we know as we do right here, at the very least, but in an awesome way, we're going to be vindicated someday in eternity. God says every crooked road will be made straight. Every false act will be made right. I mean, that's the great Christian hope. And the cool thing is, sometimes God intervenes and does it even this side of heaven. And we have lots of stories on that too. But even when he doesn't, don't ever lose heart, because God vindicates his people. It's what Esther teaches.